Welcome back everyone to more NASCAR Heat 5 here at Knee Pit Gaming. In today's video, we're going to be talking setups for Daytona and Talladega. The two tracks are very similar. These are the restrictor plate tracks, or at least where they used to use restrictor plates. We'll talk a little bit about qualifying setups. I'll show you guys both a qualifying and a race setup. We'll talk a little bit about the top three series of Cup, Xfinity, and Trucks. So let's get started. Before we hop directly into the setup discussion, a few pieces of information I want to pass along to you guys. First, be sure to check out the video I did on NASCAR Heat 4 setups in NASCAR Heat 5, where I talk not only about do the NASCAR Heat 4 setups work in Heat 5, but also about the direction that I'm taking with the NASCAR Heat 5 setups. Second piece of information is regards to tire wear settings. Now, Daytona and Talladega, these days anyway, you don't really have much of any tire wear, but my general rule for NASCAR Heat 5 is to use the normal settings, normal tire wear, normal fall off, just so you guys can get a baseline. And that way, if you use more aggressive tire wear settings, then you'll know you'll need to tighten up the setup some. If you use less aggressive, so where the tires don't wear out as much or lose as much grip, then you'll know that you could free the car up and get by with a much looser setup. So with those pieces of information out of the way, let's head into the qualifying setup. We'll begin our setup discussion with the shock settings. And here you can see 15 on the bump, 10 on the rebound. And as normal, I've tried to keep the shock settings very simple across the board without really going into the individual corners and fine tuning. The good news is for Daytona and Talladega, you really don't have to worry a whole lot about shock settings. You can get by with most anything simply because handling is not a huge issue. The 15 on the bump settings, 10 on the rebound, worked really good for me. The 15 on the bump settings gives me a little bit quicker reaction from the shocks, and the rebound of 10 helps out with any bumps that you might get, however minimum they might be at these two tracks. But again, you can use most any setting on the shocks here at Daytona and Talladega and be just fine. Next, moving on to the weight settings. Of course, we want maximum left side weight, so 54.2% there. Front weight is at 55%, which is the maximum setting. That's to provide some stability. And overall, I wanted to give you guys a setup that is a little bit on the tight side or a little bit snug to you, because I want to make sure you can have full control of the car and you don't have to worry about chasing the car around the track, even during qualifying. And that way you can always adjust from there. So maximum front weight gives us plenty of stability in the car so that you can adjust from there. The wedge of 50% allows the car to rotate through the corner. If you need the car to rotate more, then simply reduce that wedge number to 49.5, 49.0, and so on. Will certainly help the car to rotate. On the other side of things, if you need the car to be a little bit tighter, to not rotate quite as much, then increase the wedge number, 50.5, 51.0, and so on. Front and rear heights, not a whole lot here, but I did pick up a tiny bit of speed running the front rod heights a little bit higher. So that's why you see the 6 inches and 4 inches in that area. Moving on to the spring settings, 1,000 pounds on the left front, 1,200 on the right front. That provides me with a nice stable base, a firm base, and really gives me stability in the car. The lower the number you use on the front springs, the looser the car will feel, but it also introduces a lot more roll to the body. So again, just something to keep in mind there, but anything 1,000 pounds and higher is really what I prefer overall. Rear springs, 200 pounds in the left rear, 600 pounds in the right rear, maximum rear spring split so that we can keep that car rotating and maximize the amount of speed we're carrying through the corner. If the car is too loose, you've got a couple of choices here. You can increase the left rear spring to 300, 400, and so on. That will certainly tighten up the car. Or you can reduce the right rear spring from 600 down to 550, 500, and so on. Or, of course, you can do a combination of both. Anything you do to make the left rear and right rear springs closer together, then that will certainly tighten up the car and stabilize it overall. Tire pressure settings, max tire pressure across the board, and you will pick up quite a bit of speed by doing so. If you use closer to the default pressures of 26 to 28 on the left side and somewhere around 46 to 48 on the right side, you will lose quite a bit of speed. But it can also stabilize the car. But since we're talking qualifying setup right now, we're not really looking for max stability. We're looking for speed. Miscellaneous settings, max camber on left front and right front. This is only for the qualifying setup, but as much as I wish we didn't have to use that, it works. In fact, I spent a lot of time testing without this, much lower settings on the camber, but as soon as I maxed out the camber on both the left front and right front, the speed picked up by about a tenth. So it was no denying that there was speed to be had there, so that's why we're using the max settings. Front sway bar maxed out at 2.0. This is a very different feel than what you saw in Heat 4, and something that I'm really acquiring a liking to versus what we did in Heat 4. But using that maximum front sway bar tightens up the car, but also adds quite a bit of stability and reduces the roll of the car. So you're going to get a stiffer feel out of the suspension by doing so. If you feel like the car just isn't turning, then one of the options you have, although it's one of the things I would tune last, is you can reduce the front sway bar, and that will certainly help loosen up the car. Moving on to the track bar, nearly maximum track bar. Maximum is 15 inches, and we're there on the right side, not quite there on the left side. But again, Daytona and Talladega, particularly in qualifying settings, you're not really worried a whole lot about handling, so you can get away with a lot of different track bar settings. I like to keep it at or very near the top, just to keep in mind we want the higher speed through the corner. So the less amount of speed we can scrub off in the corner, the better, and the higher track bar works very well for me. Brake bias is a non-issue. We're not using the brakes at either of these tracks, particularly in qualifying settings. Grill tape at 65% is about the maximum I could get by with, but don't worry a whole lot about that. I tried 70 and got into some high temperature readings, so just not really worth pressing the issue. 65% or below should be perfectly fine here, particularly when matched up with the rear end ratio that you see at the bottom of the screen. The more RPMs you're turning, the less grill tape you ultimately have to run within a few clicks, so keep that in mind. Wheel lock and steering offset, still very much the same as what you've seen me use in the past, 10 degrees on the wheel lock and 0.05 on the steering offset. Now the wheel lock is an easy way to adjust the quickness of the steering, how sensitive the steering is. If you watched my wheel setup video, then in there I talked about the increasing the steering rate and how you could do that on a track-by-track basis rather than having to do it in the main setup options. And this is what I was talking about. That wheel lock, the higher the number you use here, the quicker your steering reaction is going to be. The lower the number, the slower the steering is going to be. So 10 degrees works very well for me, but at a place like Daytona or Talladega, I could certainly get by with lowering that somewhere around 8 or 7 and be doing well. Also, gear settings didn't touch first through third gear, and you notice fourth gear is grayed out. I'm sure there were some things going on in previous games with people using different fourth gear ratios. In NASCAR, I believe it's mandated to use a 1-to-1 ratio in fourth, but I could be wrong about that. But anyway, regardless, fourth gear is grayed out in NASCAR Heat 5. So 1.0 it is, and our rear end ratio at 2.80, which is the minimum. So I could actually run 2.86 here, and I got nearly identical time. So not a whole lot of difference there. The biggest difference in your speed at Daytona or Talladega is going to be in the line that you run. Again, you want to maximize the amount of speed you're carrying. You should be somewhere around 201, maybe even 202 at the end of the straightaways, and somewhere around 196, 197 in the corners. But the higher you can get those numbers in the corners, the higher the number you get on the straightaway and more speed you get overall. So that takes care of the qualifying setup. Now let's move over to more of a race style setup. The race setup for Daytona and Talladega, very similar to the qualifying setup with just a few differences. So rather than go through every one of the settings here, I'm simply going to point out a few areas that are different. And the first area we'll go to is the weight settings. Now, these settings are the same for the Cup car, but this is one area that I adjust for Xfinity and the Trucks. Both Xfinity and the Trucks run tighter for me using the same settings than the Cup car. So I like to come in and reduce the wedge by 1%, and that really helps the rotation of both Xfinity and Trucks. And of course, you can also try this out in the Cup car as well. It will definitely help the overall rotation of the car. But that's one of the very few differences that I have between Cup, Xfinity, and Truck. Spring settings the same, tire settings the same. One of the things you can do with the tires in the race style setup is reduce them closer to the default numbers, somewhere around 26 to 28 on the lefts and 46 to 48, maybe even 50 on the rights. That'll give you a little bit better feel. 60 on all four corners of the car and the tires feels like you're running around on balloons, and it is not a good feeling. However, it is so much faster that it's really hard not to give you guys this as a setup. But again, if you want to use more traditional tire pressure settings, then lower those to 26 to 28 on the lefts, 46 to 48, maybe even 50 on the rights. And then you'll also want to tighten up the car a little bit. So that's where I would come over to the spring settings, particularly the left rear, and I would increase this to somewhere around 500, maybe even 550, just to stabilize the car a little bit more, because you're going to be introducing more grip into the car by lowering the air pressure. So the car is going to be a bit looser, sometimes very much looser, depending on your other settings. Moving on now to the miscellaneous settings. You'll notice that the camber, quite a bit less here on the race style setup. The higher camber numbers can increase the tire wear. It doesn't always mean that you're going to get increased tire wear, but just to be on the safe side, +3 and -3. I did test in race conditions the max front camber and actually came out not too bad on the tire wear, but again, didn't want to press the issue here in the setup for you guys so that you can, I wanted to give you guys something that you can start with and then you can adjust from there and ultimately decide what you want to go with. The other thing that is different here for the race setup is slightly lower on the track bar, an inch lower on both the left and the right hand sides, just to tighten up the car, which can be helpful, particularly if you're getting hit from the rear in a bump drafting scenario, or if you lock bumpers with someone. A little bit tighter setup can really help to stabilize the car, but certainly running the same or similar settings to what we saw in the qualifying setup definitely will work. Increase the brake bias simply for green flag pit stops, or if you are one that likes to drag the brake a little bit in the draft. Increasing the brake bias will tighten the car under braking. Reducing the brake bias will loosen the car under heavy braking. So just another setup tool available to you, particularly when you're coming in for those green flag pit stops. Grill tape backed off of that a little bit simply because it's not really an issue, and I wanted to make sure that we didn't overheat during race settings. But you've got plenty of adjustability if you want to play around with the grill tape. Wheel lock and steering offset the same. Gear setting, this is something that you can play around with. As I mentioned before, I've had plenty of luck with a 286 gear. It'll have you turn in a few more RPMs and can help out in certain situations. It really just depends on the speed that you're running in the draft. If you're running online with some guys that know what they're doing, you can really run some fast speed. You'll be north of 210, 212 or higher when you get around guys that know what they're doing. But if you're like me and you spend most of your time running against the AI, then the AI don't run nearly as fast. They don't get nearly the good runs that you can get with other human players. So again, feel free to adjust that gear setting, and that rear end ratio can go from anywhere from 280 up maybe a couple of clicks to 291. Again, just depending on who you're racing with. The rear end ratio is also another thing that changes with Xfinity and Trucks. Xfinity, I'm usually somewhere around a 291, maybe a little bit higher than that, maybe a 294, somewhere in that range. And then with the Trucks, I believe it's a 3.0, maybe even a little bit higher in that as well, because the Xfinity and Trucks are not quite as fast as the Cup cars, so you'll need to adjust the rear end ratio accordingly. So that's going to do it for both Daytona and Talladega, since I used the same setup for both. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned for more NASCAR Heat 5.